Yes, hello to you all once again, welcome back. It's Chris here with Classic Dirt Bike TV to continue to show you more of those old school vintage dirt bikes from a way back in the day when, of course, at that time the sport was called scrambling and not the modern day equivalent of motocross. But I'd just like to say welcome aboard to all the brand new subscribers who have tuned in and subscribed to my channel, and of course thanks to everybody out there for your mainly positive comments on my video postings. So right now we're going to take a look at another long lost British classic, and it's a bike that you very seldom see at racetracks these days, but in their day these were fantastic British made machines. So let's dive straight into that video now and take a look at this 1969 Greeves Griffon 380. Now, the history of the Greeves motorcycle company is quite well documented of how they began by building three-wheeled cars for disabled drivers and then diverting their manufacturing into making motorcycles that included road bikes and of course these very popular scrambles bikes as well. So we're not going to dwell too much on the history of the Greeves manufacturing company, but we're going to concentrate on this one particular model here, which is the 1969 Greeves Griffon 380, a bike that was hugely popular in Europe and internationally when it first hit the race circuits at the end of the 1960s. And so in this featured picture slideshow, we're going to have a look around this very fine example, although unfortunately no video clips this time, because these pictures were taken long before I set up my YouTube channel. But I do hope you still enjoy having a look around. Now, the 1969 Greeves Griffon was the bike that replaced the earlier Challenger machines, and if you're of a certain age then you'll probably remember these old Challengers with their alloy I-beam front downtube frames and their quirky leading link front forks. And this example here is a 1965 250 MX3, which for the early 1960s it was a staple diet for many of the great British scramble stars of that era, because these old Challengers were quick bikes for their time. But as we begin with the Griffon's chassis, which you can see that it's just a conventional tubular steel frame and not the chassis that was made for those earlier Challengers. And I think the main reason that Bert Greeves redesigned these new frames was that most other off-road machines of that time had the traditional light gauge tubular steel chassis, so Bert wanted to keep up with that current trend and go with the flow. But of course that's not to say that there was anything wrong with these earlier I-beam alloy downtube parts or those Greeves racers, because in actual fact they were decades ahead of their time, because there was always that argument about which manufacturer invented the first alloy motocross race chassis, and it's usually a toss-up between Honda or Yamaha in the 1990s. But here's the proof that Greeves were already using alloy motocross chassis for their scramblers in the 1960s. Although getting back to our 380 chassis, which as I remember I think was made from Reynolds 531 steel tubing, which was a kind of manganese steel type of composition, which allowed the use of much lighter gauge metal than conventional steel tubing, and it's got 4 mounting points there to secure the Greeves engine inside, although the front mounting plates had slightly elongated holes, which means that the same chassis could take either this bigger 380 motor or even the slightly smaller 250 engine without the need for any type of modifications. But this chassis was certainly very light and very strong, and it suited this 380 two-stroke engine almost perfectly. But moving on to our Greeves power plant, which was a single-cylinder piston-port two-stroke that had a twin-port exhaust barrel, just quite similar to the old Czechoslovakian CZs of their day. And normally these 380s were fueled by a 32mm Amal concentric carburetor, and behind those fiberglass side panels there was usually two Fram paper type air filters that led into a decent sized plenum chamber to supply the air into the engine. And although this was still an old school air supply system, by all accounts it still worked very well. Which of course brings us onto this quite substantially sized cylinder head and barrel, which looks ginormous for just a 380cc engine. But many of these Greeves and these Griffons in particular were aimed at the American export market, where desert racing was a massive event in the late 1960s and early 70s, and these Greeves engines were given these huge cooling fins just to try and help them dissipate that extreme heat a little bit better. And also both the engine cylinder head and the barrel were secured separately from the crankcase, rather than having long bolts going through from the top of the head, then through the barrel and onto the crankcases below in the conventional manner, which they say was all engineered just to try and stop stretching and fatigue on the barrel and head's fasteners when the motor got extremely hot. But as I said, it was a single cylinder engine, but with twin exhaust ports with these double header pipes that ran over the top of the engine and then joined onto a small expansion chamber that was located underneath the bike seat, which, as I'm led to believe, never really gave any issues of excess heat while you were sitting on the bike. And those twin header pipes in the little expansion chamber under the seat usually then led onto a small steel tubed tailpipe here at the rear. But because this exhaust system was separated into 4 different sections, it of course made any maintenance or repairs quite easy to carry out. And so on the Griffon's transmission side, we had an all-metal clutch assembly with no cork-driven plates that you'd find in a conventional motorcycle. These Greeves engine clutches had 7 steel and 7 brass plates, and they could be removed from the engine as a complete clutch assembly. But the added bonus here was that both clutches on this 380 and the 250 were identical and therefore interchangeable, although the 250 engine used a 21 tooth primary sprocket, while this 380 used a 25. Now moving on to the gearbox on our vintage Greeves. Now, as I remember, I think it was a 4-speed Greeves Albion unit that simply bolted on to the back of the engine, and it was connected to the crankshaft by way of a primary chain onto the clutch and crank in the conventional manner. But also for 1969, the sparks for the engine were supplied by a Stefa energy transfer magneto, which I assume was an early form of CDI electronic ignition. But again, this ignition system proved to be quite rugged and reliable. Although certainly for a big bore two-stroker from the 1960s, this was still a great engine and ideally suited to fit inside this light steel tubular chassis. And it's actually a very compact, powerful engine because, as I recall, I think it put out just short of that 40 horsepower mark, but it's certainly that large, bulky cylinder and head that makes this engine look much bigger than it actually is. And if you could get a good rider into the saddle of one of these Griffons that knows how to work this 380 engine, then this bike is more than capable of taking on even bigger engine machines, 4-stroke or 2-stroke. So moving on to the front end of our 380 Griffon, it's a pair of conventional Italian Serianis that are actually upgrades on that older leading link suspension systems that were fitted onto the earlier Challenger models. Although Greeves still had the older leading link forks as an option on these Griffons, so that's why you still quite often see some of these Griffon bikes with that older leading link front end, because it was usually just a matter of personal preference as to what front end you preferred on your Greeves model. But it was only around 7 inches of travel that you had to play with here at this front end, so these Greeves were pretty much like most other off-road race bikes of their day, with very little scope for making changes to the rebound and damping. But as I've said in many of my other video postings on these old vintage racers, this of course was the suspension technologies of their day. But both of these front and the rear hubs on our 69 Griffon are Greaves' own manufactured parts, and are made at their own premises and made from alloy, and then all nicely polished up to give the bike a bit of bling. Although again, it was still old school vintage drum brakes, as you'd expect on a bike from the late 1960s, with the front being operated by a simple cable and that rear brake by a metal brake rod assembly. But even although these brakes and their operating linkages were vintage compared to a modern day motocrosser, these were still quite adequate to stop or slow our Griffon when the need arose. Now, as I remember, I'm pretty sure that many of these early Griffons did have high tensile chrome plated steel wheels back in the day, but our example here seems to have a pair of Spanish Acront rims made from alloy, which I don't know if these are actually correct for its year, but then again, this could have been just another one of those buyer's options when you specified the components that you wanted when you ordered your machine. And so moving on to the rear of our Greeves, which again I'm pretty sure in 1969 it would have been a simple pair of British-made Girling dampers that would have been fitted onto the back of these scramblers, and those originals have been substituted here for a pair of Falcon classic shocks, and these are made from much better materials. So again, these are good quality upgrades to those 1969 British-made Girling parts that would have been fitted at Greeves HQ. Now, the fuel tanks on many of these older Greeves bikes were usually made of old school fiberglass, which was the motorcycle material of its day when it came to building these gas tanks and things like the bodywork side panels as well, because once the actual moulds were all made, it was a relatively inexpensive process to make and then colour all of the individual parts. But these tanks, as you'd expect, were super light and usually held enough pre-mixed fuel to keep our 380 Greeves engine spinning over on even the longest of races. Although the downside of this fiberglass construction is that if you're racing these older bikes using modern day fuels, then they can eventually eat away at the insides of these fiberglass tanks if fuel's left stored in them for long periods. But of course, that's not a problem if you simply drain the tank down after each use. And so the Greeves Griffon's rear swing arm is a simple square box section low carbon steel item that's not mounted onto the chassis in the usual fashion with a long threaded bolt that passes through the swing arm from one side to the other. This Griffon swing arm is actually suspended from the frame using a pair of rubber bonded mountings on each side with two short bolts, one on either side to hold it on to the chassis. So it's quite a unique system, and I'm sure some of the old Shenny frames back in the day had a similar layout to this, but it still seemed to work very well in practice and never appeared to have too much flex while it was used on the track. But on the bike's comfort side, there wasn't really a lot of padding for your backside when it came to this racing seat, which was quite firm, to put it lightly, although it was still long enough for the rider to move his weight from the back to the front, or vice versa as required, which is why you always saw quite a lot of these classic riders back in the day spending most of their time standing up on the pegs, because with that limited suspension movement on the front and the back, it was often a very rough ride for their pilots. And again, no plastic or modern materials used for the front and rear mudguards, proper vintage alloy mudguards for our 69 Griffon, which almost all off-road bikes of that 1950s and 60s had at that time. Of course, these weren't as durable or as flexible as the latter day plastic, but you could certainly straighten these aluminium mudguards a couple of times if they got damaged, but more often than not they'd eventually break. But nevertheless, these alloy parts were certainly a lot nicer looking than those dreaded plastic items. And as you can see, our featured Griffon appears to still have all of its original controls with the proper handlebars, grips, gasser throttle, levers and cables, which is quite rare to find on one of these Greeves classics, but nevertheless this is still a very good original example of a relatively rare Greeves classic, but it's quite rare to find one of these with most of its stock parts still fitted onto the bike. Although in 1969 you were certainly spoiled with regards your colour choices if you wanted to buy one of these Griffons in that year, and these examples here belong to Irishmen Craig and McCoo, and this will just give you a rough idea of some of the exotic colours that you could have with this kind of zany gold flake type of theme on this 380 bike, or maybe if it took your fancy, you could also have this blue colour as well, although this bike here is a 250 example of our Griffon 380. But as you can gather, there were certainly plenty of options for specifying your front suspension and colour schemes when you place an order for one of these Greeves race bikes, so the options to buy one of these machines were certainly varied. Although to further improve the development of this 380 Greeves motor, Dr. Gordon Blair, who was widely known as a specialist on the two-stroke engine, and he was a lecturer at Queen's University in Belfast at that time, he was consulted to do a study on just how to improve the power and performance of the Greeves engine. But his findings and improvements wouldn't actually see the light of day until the launch of the 1973 Greeves 380 QUB bike, which was still reputed to be one of the last Greeves scramblers of any significance, because Greeves in 1975 were then beginning to struggle as an off-road motorcycle manufacturer due to that increasing competition and volume of machines that were being imported from Japan. But nevertheless, when these 380 Griffons were sold around the world in the late 1960s and early 70s, they were still widely accepted as yet another very good quality British-made classic, because this bike, as I said, had a light, strong tubular steel chassis and an engine that was both powerful and very reliable and quite easy to maintain. And although Greeves did do a decent trade in selling these bikes as desert racers across the USA, in their native UK, these Griffons and its predecessor, the Challenger, were the staple diet of some of the biggest scramble stars of their time. So there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed taking a quick look at that very nice and quite rare 1969 Greeves 380 vintage twin shocker. But of course we will be back again very soon to check out more long lost vintage off-roaders when we come back to Classic Dirt Bike TV.